Hey everybody, it's Hudson, and I'm here to talk about why everyone should be excited. All you photographers should be excited about the total solar eclipse that's coming this August. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about why that eclipse is so special, some maybe strategies for figuring out where you want to be for it, as well as kind of your grand vision of how you'd like to capture the eclipse if you're going to photograph it. And then I want to delve into some of the gear and tools you might want to use to do a little bit better job at capturing it and how to use them. So first off, this eclipse is a total solar eclipse. The difference between a partial solar eclipse that you might remember, looking at through special glasses as a kid, and a total solar eclipse is that the moon is going to completely cover the sun if you're within the path of totality. There's kind of a narrow band moving through the United States this August that's going to be in complete totality. And you'll probably see stars in the middle of the day when this happens. You'll be able to look up at the thing with your bare eyes. It's important, there'll be a partial phase beforehand and a partial phase afterwards where you really need to protect your eyes, protect your camera sensors. But in the absolute moment of totality, you're going to be able to look up right at the thing. It'll be like a black disc with kind of an aura of the sun coming out around it. A really exciting thing to view, a really exciting thing to photograph. It'll be unique. There are people that chase these things all over the world. And it's a pretty rare event. Over the last 100 years, there have only been 14 times that total solar eclipses have touched US territories. And the last time one touched the United States outside of Alaska or Hawaii was 1979, and that happened on a really nasty February morning. It just sort of grazed the Northwest and no one really saw it. So this one happening in the middle of August, crossing the entire United States in the late morning, pretty special event that if you can get to, you really, really should. Any photographer that loves these kinds of events should be in the path of totality if you can be. So, let's talk about a little bit about where it's going to be. And there's a great online tool. There's going to be a link to it with wherever this video is posted, and on my blog you can find the link to this. I'm going to just jump here on my computer, and it's here at eclipse2017.org. There's a great interactive Google map. And I'm just going to talk really briefly about how to use this thing. Just like any Google map, you can go ahead and zoom in. You can see that this thing is hitting first in Oregon, moving down across the United States through the Great Plains and down through the south and exiting in South Carolina. So take a look at where you want to be along this path. Think about it. The way to use this map, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. You can search, I can put in Portland. Portland, boom, kind of center in on where I'm at. Now I'm a little bit above the zone of totality. Down here is the farm that I grew up on, right on it. This is going to be in a different time zone. It's in the UT time zone. For Oregon, we're going to be subtracting 7 hours from this on the West Coast on Pacific time. So this is about 10:17 in the morning is the start of the total eclipse. The partial eclipse starts over an hour beforehand, about 9:05 a.m. And absolute moment of totality, you can kind of see as I'm moving down this timeline, it sort of shows you what's happening with totality in this. You want to be somewhere between these two red lines to see the total solar eclipse. And the closer you are to the blue line, the longer and more intense that solar eclipse is going to be. So the way to use this map is to go ahead, search it, find a location that you'd like to photograph the eclipse at, and try to get there. Now, the problem is that we're not quick on this. If you haven't already made hotel reservations, if you don't already have flights, you need to get right on it. I know that we're projecting 1 million people are already planning on coming into Oregon. Here in Oregon, it's going to be a little bit lower in the sky because it's the first place earlier in the morning. As you move towards the east, it's later in the day as this comes along, so it's going to be closer and closer to high noon when the light is not as great and it's a little more intense in the partial phase. So Oregon's a really great place to photograph it. And commensurately, there are about 1 million people coming. I think that if you were going to try to go, it passes pretty close to the Tetons. You'd have a really hard time getting to the Tetons if you don't already have reservations. Now, a suggestion I'm going to make is try to get there earlier, a number of days earlier so that you can practice some of the techniques we're about to talk about, and you can get out there and look at exactly where it's going to be, where you want to be, figure out your scene, and be ready for it when it happens. I think that's going to get you in good stead, and it might be easier for air travel. But just as a heads up, there've already been cases of hotels canceling all of their reservations that were booked a year ago because they realized the demand and what's happening is special, and then jacking their rates up 10 times and gouging everyone and reopening reservations. There's been a lot of scandal about that, particularly on the Oregon coast. But you need to get some bookings if you don't already have them. If you want to bring special gear with you that you don't own that you might want to rent, Borrow Lenses is going to maybe be able to just be a great resource for you, and you could potentially ship it right to the hotel you want to go to, so you don't have to travel with quite as much gear. That's a cool little trick. So essentially, the message is this thing is special. You want to get there. I have a workshop that I'm running in the 3 days leading up to the eclipse right here in Portland, and I have rooms reserved for my workshop students. And I really wish I could say, everybody come join the workshop, but I like to keep my workshops really small. And at this point, there's only one slot left to fill. So, if you're the first one to jump in and grab it, or if you want to be on the waiting list, go ahead, contact me through my website, hudsonhenry.com. We're going to practice for the eclipse. We're going to look at some locations that are within striking distance of Portland. We're about a half an hour from the zone of totality here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. We're also going to do some star work. Another thing to consider is if you can go someplace without too much light pollution, the eclipse happens at the same time as a new moon, so stars will be really good in the location that you're working at. So, I want to talk a little bit about how you might decide to capture the eclipse. There are some choices that you have. Do you want to use a long lens and try to capture just a close-up of the sun obscured by the moon, and maybe do an HDR merge image where you see as much of the aura coming off the sun? It's kind of the solar corona is going to be like a cloud kind of interesting patterns coming out from behind the black disk that's the moon. That's a pretty tricky technical thing to do. There are some websites I would say that you should go just sort of research doing a close-up of a total solar eclipse. I'm going to steer you more towards thinking about placing the eclipse in some landscape, maybe a little bit wider angle. The choice is certainly yours, but there are some pretty compelling locations that, depending on how high the sun is going to be in the sky, and we're just about to talk about gauging that based on the location that you've chosen, I think that using a little wider lens, a little normal lens, putting some sort of silhouetted landscape in the scene, maybe even just doing an HDR and getting some detail in your landscape, and placing that solar eclipse in kind of an interesting place, a little smaller in the image, but setting it in your landscape and showing what it's like to be there. It might be a crowd of people, it might be buildings in downtown, it might be a really cool tree and sort of a pastoral landscape. Even just the Great Plains and some rolling hills, think Tuscan sort of style, with the eclipse happening up overhead, could be a really compelling thing. I think that you're going to want to really hone in on where you want to be, and then figure out that composition in advance and practice it. And I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks, some tools that we can use, starting with some desktop software and then moving into some mobile software to help you scout in advance of ever getting to the location that you want to go to. And then again, I suggest you get there early. You get there and you use that mobile software. You figure out exactly where the sun's going to be, and you get there for the few days ahead of time when the eclipse doesn't happen, but practice just photographing the sun and get it right where you want. Know where you want to put your tripod, having practiced it before. And I'd say that there are some really cool images to be captured during the partial phase of the eclipse, and you can practice that anywhere you are by using some shadow lines and partially obscuring the sun and working to get sun stars, and we'll talk about that in a second too. But first I want to just show some of the scouting software that we've got available to us. So I really like using the photographer's ephemeris for this. And right now I'm centered here on Portland. This is some software, I'll put a link to it. It's just free to use on the web. And you can sort of move this pin around wherever you want this pin to be. The way it works, we can click here on the calendar. We're in April of 2017. I want to go ahead to August. This thing is happening on August 21st. It's a Monday, 2017. And we know from looking at that map that we just looked at, it's going to be right around 10 a.m. And as you see, as I move this, these blue line and yellow line are the sun and the moon. And it makes sense that they're going to be together for this eclipse because the moon's obscuring the sun. So right about 10, what did we say? 18, something like that. What was our time here? we were looking at the maximum being at 1018. So we can jump back over here, see how you use these things in conjunction, and we're going to just go and put ourselves at 1018. That's the maximum solar eclipse, and you can see these two lines are becoming one. And then I can zoom in on this map. It's another sort of standard Google map, and let's say I wanted to capture that brand new bridge they just put in Portland here. I could think about where would I want to be on the waterfront to put the eclipse right over the top of the new bridge that's right here by our Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. Boom, there it is. I've got a place to go and be. And I can go ahead, zoom in and get a lot more granular level of detail to figure out, exactly what street, where along the waterfront sidewalk would I want to be. Boom, you get the idea. So this is some really cool software to locate yourself in space with where you want to be. So once you've gotten where you want to be on the ground using a photographer's ephemeris, grab your mobile device, whether it's iPhone, Android. There's a phenomenal app. I'm an Android user. This is my Google Pixel phone, and I like this app, Sun Surveyor. Not only does it show me what's happening with the sun and the moon as the widget on my desktop, but you jump in, it's got all this great information about what's happening with the sun, the moon, the Milky Way, in any location. Right here I'm set on Portland, Oregon, at any time or date in the future or the past or present. So I go ahead here, I'm choosing August 21st, 2017, the day of the eclipse. I can scroll left and right with this timeline. Right now we're at 10:19 a.m. I can move back and forth, 10:20 a.m. Oh, that's 9, but right around in when the eclipse is going to happen. And then there's this great mode in here called Live View, where I can literally just pick this up and it's going to show me what's happening with the sun on that date. Where's it going to be? It's right above my right monitor here at 10:22 a.m. on the 21st. So, what this thing's doing for you is it's literally, you get close to where you want to be, you've got some object that you want to photograph, and then you can fine tune by using this live view and saying, well, right when the eclipse is in the peak of its totality, it'll be hovering between the two towers of this bridge right where I want, or between these two buildings, or right above that oak tree if I put my tripod right here. And so you can literally, in the days leading up to the eclipse, take your equipment out there and practice. And that's the main point of all this. Use your online mapping, use the photographer's ephemeris to figure out where you want to be. Get out there, use your mobile device, use the Sun Surveyor app, and figure out exactly where you want that tripod set up. And practice. I would say try to be there a few days in advance, see what the sun's doing. It's going to be in close to the same place at the same time, and you can practice with your equipment, making sure that you get sort of the composition that you want. And some tips and tricks, I've done a lot of this kind of photography in the past where, I'm using these apps to get exactly where I want to be, and then, go out, figure out where the moon is going to be rising right over Mount Hood and where I should be standing to capture it. The same thing with a crescent moon rising right before dawn, or the sunrise in the crater rim of Mount St. Helens, or setting it beside this cool sea stack on the Olympic coast, and figuring out in the afternoon, where am I going to want to be? Where's the sun going to come down? Because it kind of comes down across the sky, moving from north to south at the same time as it's coming down in the west. So these apps and software can really help you dial in right where you want to be. The other thing I would say is, because during the partial eclipse, the moon is going to be obscuring a little bit of the sun, you have a chance to do some really cool sun stars. And we're going to talk about some techniques and about some equipment in the next section of this video. But, practice in the days leading up to the eclipse, stopping your lens down, real narrow aperture, a high aperture number, f16, f22, somewhere in there, and practice with your equipment, sort of partially obscuring the sun, and getting some good solid sun stars and getting that technique down and nailed. I'd say start doing it right now, with the sun high in the sky, mid-morning, whenever it's going to be where you're going to be when you're photographing the eclipse, and do some things like this. Here's a windmill in Greece, or my friend Blake Rudis in Moab just last week. I was practicing with the Tokina 11-20, which is a lens I'm going to discuss in a second, and checking out how its sun star works, which I really, really like. So partially obscuring the sun, you can get a beautiful sun star with a narrow aperture with the right kinds of lenses. So, let's talk about gear for a second. You've figured out how you want to photograph the eclipse, where you want to be, what do you want to photograph it with. And I think, first and foremost, you want a rock solid tripod and a head that you can easily get your composition locked in and it's sturdy and you're not going to get bumped and moved during the eclipse, during all the excitement. I tend to prefer a bowl mount set of tripod legs and a fluid head like most videographers use, and I prefer that for still photography. This happens to be my heavy Sackler head. I also use a lightweight Manfrotto head that's lighter than a really right stuff, BH55 that so many people like, and about a third of the price, and I find much easier for all aspects of photography that I do. It's really easy to stay level. If you're interested in why I feel that way, there's a video on my YouTube channel. I'll put a link in here about why I like fluid heads, and actually you can rent them too. If you go to Borrow Lenses, look in their video tripod section and you'll find the kind of heads that I'm talking about in that video. So a good solid steady tripod, whatever kind it is. A camera body like my Nikon D810 here that has a really wide dynamic range. Now I think the bodies out right now with the widest dynamic range are utilizing Sony's latest sensors. The Nikon D810 has a Sony sensor in it, really, really wide dynamic range. And by that I mean the ability to capture details in the shadows at the same time as it's capturing details in the highlights. Because we're going to be shooting directly into the sun throughout the partial part of the eclipse. And then during the total eclipse, it's going to get really dark because the sun's totally behind the moon, but there's going to be really cool kind of aura coming out from behind the moon, and we'd like to capture as much of that detail as we can in every frame that we photograph. The Sony A7 series are another really, really good high dynamic range, similar sensor to what Nikon's using. It's their own sensor. If you're not into Nikon or Sony, get one of the latest and best bodies that you possibly can in the brand of camera that you like to use, because today's sensors across the board have more dynamic range than last year's, which have dramatically more dynamic range than 5 years ago. So if you're normally shooting with an older camera, this is a great opportunity. Rent something a few days in advance, get really familiar with it. Borrow Lenses rents all these bodies that I'm talking about and many, many more. Just get something really modern with good dynamic range, and you can research that online really easily. Just research the body you're interested in and dynamic range. You're gonna want lenses that are good at photographing straight into backlight. Lenses with very little ghosting and flare when you shoot them straight into a bright point source like the sun. And a lot of times prime lenses, non-zoom lenses, do a much better job of this than zoom lenses. There are some zoom lenses that I can vouch for. I like, in the wide angle lenses, I really like Tokina's 11 to 20 millimeter lens, the f2.8, it's built for smaller compact sensors, but it'll work on a full frame as long as you don't go all the way down to 11 if you mess around with that. It has a beautiful sunstar, as I was just showing in the examples a second ago. The Nikon's 14 to 24 is a great lens for shooting into bright sun, but it can't take a filter. We're going to talk about filters in a second, so that's a little bit of a problem. Nikon and Canon's 24 to 70 f2.8, the latest version of those are great shooting into the sun, as are the latest version of their 70 to 200 millimeter lenses shooting straight into the sun. Pretty much most of the prime lenses that Zeiss is putting out, as well as Voigtlander, which are put out for a wide variety of camera bodies from Nikon, Canon, Sony, you name it. Really, really good prime lenses shooting straight into the sun. So, research that, figure out which ones are better than others, practice with them. Like I said, practice partially obscuring the sun and creating sun stars with a narrow aperture. Now let's talk about how to actually photograph the eclipse as it's happening. And there's two sort of phases I want you to think about. The partial eclipse that happens before and after the total eclipse. And that's going to last a long time. It's going to be about, somewhere around an hour of the moon slowly kind of occluding and blocking out the sun more and more and more, and then it'll come away and you'll start having the sun emerge from behind the moon. So there's going to be a phase before and a phase after that are partial. And during that, you got to be really careful of your eyes and of your camera's sensor. I'm going to recommend that you frame up the scene that you want to frame up. You use a set of Eclipse glasses, and you can get really high quality dark welding glasses. Take a look at what's recommended for looking into the sun, or you can buy these cheap Eclipse viewing glasses off of Amazon. I'll put a link up on my blog and where this is posted for these Eclipse glasses. I've got these for my workshop students for the Eclipse. And you're going to want to protect your eyes from staring directly into the sun. I mean, as photographers, there's few assets we have that are more important than our eyes. Staring directly in the sun can do permanent damage, so avoid that. I'm going to also recommend that you use live view on your camera, and I think a really, really dark, high-quality neutral density filter is going to be a good thing just to protect your sensor from long-term exposure to the sun coming directly onto the sensor through the lens. The lens shouldn't be focusing the sun right on that sensor for a long period of time. People might debate and argue with me, but you know, I spend enough money on my camera equipment, I want to protect it. My favorite really dark neutral density is the Solus, the Hoya Solus 10-stop neutral density filter. And that's what I plan on using for this Eclipse. There are dedicated solar filters out there that might get you a slightly better result during the partial eclipse, but then they're going to be a little less utility after the eclipse. You know, they're expensive, you can't necessarily rent those. There are also really expensive filters for the sun, solar filters that go between the lens and the camera. Again, you know, if you're not photographing the sun all the time, I'm not sure that that expenditure is worth it. But you know, go ahead, try the dark neutral density 10-stop or more, whatever your favorite filter brand. Just research and make sure that they're good and neutral at the high levels. And you know, again, I can vouch for the Hoya Solus. Those are great filters. So in that mode leading up to the total eclipse, when you have the partial eclipse happening, you're going to keep the glasses on your head to protect your eyes when you're looking at the sun. You're going to put the camera in live view, in which case you can take your glasses off as you're looking at live view and composing through that. For the most part, you want to keep that neutral density filter on there protecting your sensor, and you can just have a little bit longer exposures. And I'm going to recommend that you bracket the heck out of this scene. And what does that mean? Well, your camera, most modern cameras, and I'm recommending you use the latest and greatest for this for its dynamic range, have automatic bracketing modes, and they have it usually set up where you can just hit the shutter once and it'll take a series of frames over and underexposed along with one that's properly exposed. And I would take as many as your camera will automatically do. Just zing, 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 zing. You know, they'll slow down with the longer shutters. And the reason for it is just you want to make sure that you get the proper exposure in there. And it's nice after the fact having the ability to potentially do some high dynamic range blending with software. And I'll talk about that in another video another time after the eclipse, but I think this is an excellent opportunity to do a little kind of natural looking HDR blending and get some more detail out of these images. So I'm going to recommend that you capture everything in a series of frames over and underexposed. And I would say the gap between frames with our modern sensors and the ability to get that wide dynamic range, make sure you get about 2 stops in between each. So you know, you could do a second and a quarter second. You don't necessarily need to do every single stop, a second, a half second, a quarter second. I would recommend that you use aperture priority mode or manual mode if you're comfortable with manual mode. But aperture priority would be a good mode to be in. I would use spot metering, and I would meter for just outside the sun. You know, in the bright part of the sky that's not in this white kind of corona around the sun. I would meter for, you know, just out here in the brighter part of the blue in this scene. In this picture in Kauai on the coast, maybe, you know, just right in here in this brighter part of the sky that's not in the brightest part. Here, you know, right in here, obviously this is through some clouds, so it's soft. And this picture in Denali, this 360-degree panoramic, I'd meter somewhere right here, just outside the sun, spot meter the sky, and then of course, you know, chimp and make sure that you're getting your exposure kind of in the range that you want. Take a look at the back of the camera. Some are going to look really underexposed in the bracketing, some are going to look really overexposed. As long as you're sort of getting that range where in the middle looks interesting and good to you. You know, and I'd say again, practice, practice, practice. Get out in the days leading up. If you have questions about anything that's happening, hit me up with questions. I'm always around for that. When it comes to the total eclipse, it's when the moon goes in completely in front of the sun, it gets dark, you know, there's no more edge of the sun showing. You're only going to have a couple of minutes. It's amazing. You should start seeing stars coming out in the sky. Take those glasses off and just enjoy it for a second. You know, don't even photograph. Just be with it a little bit. I'd say take some time between each set of multiple exposures that you're doing and just enjoying the event itself and the people around you, because this is a really special moment you're going to remember for a long time. At the same time, you take that neutral density filter off, you take your glasses off, you can look at this with your naked eye now. Continue to bracket so that you've got the ability to maybe blend images with that whole corona coming out around the sun, because that's going to be really interesting and it's going to be much brighter than the rest of the scene. You're going to see it with your eyes, but you're going to want to bracket to make sure that your camera is getting it too. Keep photographing, enjoy it. The minute that the sun starts peeking back out from behind the moon shadowing it, you're going to want to put your glasses back on if you're looking at it, neutral density filter back on the camera to have live view just sitting there turned on. Again, you can look at the live view without your glasses. Keep working. It's the same thing. You have a whole nother chance to go through and capture the partial eclipse any way you want. And again, when you're capturing the partial eclipse, make sure you capture some images where you stop way down to f/22, f/16 or beyond in there, whatever works best with the lens that you're using as you practice, and get some of those sun star images where the moon's shadow across the sun is kind of creating that partially occluded sun, and you get the beautiful sun stars coming off of it with the lens that you're using. Another thing to consider, when you're in the moment of totality, set your aperture to f8 or f11, because that's where your lens is designed to perform at its best. When you're doing those sun star images, you'll get better, cleaner, nicer looking sun stars at those really narrow apertures, but you're liable to have a little bit less sharp image overall because of diffraction at those extreme apertures. You get just a little fuzziness to the details. So I would try to remember to back that aperture back down to f8, f11, somewhere in there, to get a really, really nice sharp image during the time of totality, because that's where the magic is happening. So I said you can ask questions of me. You're more than welcome to. My website, hudsonhenry.com. You can find all my contact information there. I'm a constant coach in On1 softwares, in On1's Plus forums and on their Plus community site. So if you're not a Plus member, something to consider joining. It's a really cool community of photographers all kind of working together to become better photographers, and we do critiques and challenges and weekly videos with tips and tricks, and there's video courses and lots of cool stuff in there, and I'm constantly responsive in there, so that's a place to go. Just go to on1.com and look up Plus, and you can find me there. You can find me at my site. I'll be doing a video on post-production after the eclipse that I hope you'll check out. It's going to be a ton of fun. I can't wait to get these images and start processing them and share what I've learned through the process. And my main point is, get there, get your travel booked now, get the equipment that you need reserved, rent it. You don't necessarily need to buy it. Borrow lenses is a great resource. I'm here for any questions, and just enjoy this thing and get out there and photograph it.